Hello, 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 everybody. I hope you're all having a wonderful time zone, and if not, well, I hope I can make it just a little bit better. For those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Gordon Lisa. I'm your resident old man voidside mechanic, variety streamer, voice actor. I go by he, him, and welcome on in. Tonight, we're back to reading something from, we're back to readings from Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I did put a warning into the chat this time. I pinned it just so that everyone would be aware, because I imagine most people know that this is a book. It's literally hundreds of years old. There's gonna be some stuff in there that's maybe not ideal, but I just want to make sure that people are aware that I am going to talk about some of the things that are in there. Like last time, they were talking about some very negative stereotypes uh against people from Asia, which was just but regardless, that is a thing that happens. I'm certainly not going to apologize for it. I'm very much not going to excuse it. uh People had bad ideas and bad thoughts. People still have bad ideas and bad thoughts. So it is what it is. But we don't have to like it, and we certainly don't have to reinforce it. So, that being said, yeah, we're going to be doing some reading into Frankenstein tonight. We're starting at chapter 14. There's a grand total of 24 chapters, so I don't think we're gonna finish tonight. I could be wrong, but I will make sure that every part of this is uploaded to YouTube. I will probably tonight make sure that part one uh, is adjusted because I think I was a little quiet on part one, but I'll make it into a playlist, put it up on YouTube. It's all mostly there already. It's just I haven't made it public yet, but I'll take part one, put it public tonight. That way, at no point will anybody not have some version of the VOD to come back to. But yeah. And let's see. So as I'm looking ahead into the schedule, we've got one more Monday, which maybe we'll finish it then. We'll see. If not, we'll go into November and continue reading on Mondays. I don't know yet if I have a plan for anything for Halloween itself. I previously did not, and part of it is just the fact of I know for a fact that I'm going to be handing out candy on the day of, and the evening of, the night of, I might be able to do something, but I don't know if uh what time that will be, because there could be let's just call it interruptions if someone comes to trick or treat very late into the evening, which does happen occasionally, but not super often. So yeah. But that said, yeah, we're gonna get started into the book real soon. I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. Like, I know the general story of Frankenstein, but the actual book I had never actually read until now. I just read or experienced permutations of it previously, which is odd because you'd think that this would be one that would be taught in schools, and yet I don't remember ever reading this for school. So, to that end, let us head over to here. Now, the eye tracker is still on, so you can kind of follow along with me reading. Hi. Oh, so I have to tell you all a really funny thing that happened earlier today. So I was taking Gremlin out for a walk, and my partner has started setting up Halloween decorations all over the place, and we have this one window. There's just a bunch of Halloween decorations set up, and one of them is like, it looks like a black cat made out of black tinsel, if that makes sense. With its back arched up and its tail straight up like it's alarmed. And Gremlin, who loves Stormcloud, just adores her, but just doesn't not know how to act, went up to the window and fussed and whined, thinking it was Stormcloud and thinking that Stormcloud was upset at something. And in part, that's also due to earlier today. Stormcloud sitting on my desk, I moved my chair and it pinched her tail. She's fine. Nothing's, seriously hurt. But she yowled in pain, and Gremlin came from across the place, just like trotted over. It's like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Do you need me to lick it and make it better?" And Stormcloud was like, "No, no, I do not." And Gremlin was just fussing and whining. It was the cutest thing. It really was. I'm going to give everybody a little more time to come in before I get started fully, but We will get started soon-ish. That said, I have updated, in other news, I have updated my uh, Twitch page now, such that my Blue Sky account and my Linktree are now in the description, in the About section. So, Blue Sky, for those of you who don't know, is a social media network equivalent to Twitter. That is not Twitter. And since last week, about middle of the week, there was a series of decisions made by Twitter that are generally unpopular. There's been something of an exodus of people from Twitter to Blue Sky. And I gotta tell you right now, like, there's features I want Blue Sky to have. Like, I can't multi-post easily. But beyond that, it's so much nicer. I don't have to worry about bots all over the place. I don't have to worry about people with truly noxious opinions that I don't want to deal with. I can just see other people whose content I'd like to see and promote and have conversations with them. And I have a thread where there was a trend going around where it's like, oh, top 10 games to play to understand you. I can't narrow it down to 10. I can try, right? But I'm going to miss something. I'm going to miss something that I feel is monumentally important. I've had too many games that have been too important to my life to just go, oh, here's 10. So I've been going through in what is roughly 4-year segments, give or take, and just pulling my top 4 games from that period of time. So, very early on, games that were playable on like the Commodore 64 or the Apple IIe, uh, uh, then, old NES games, Sega Genesis, original Game Boy, and today was going back to computer stuff, and it was just like, I forgot how close together some of these games came out. And it is wild how quickly video game technology advanced from the period of, say, 1993-ish, 1992 to 2002. Like, when you look at video games from that era and the vast difference that exists within the graphical quality, complexity, storylines. I mean, in the early 90s, video games were just starting to have voiced sections. They developed, and I'm citing a specific game today, which is X-Wing, which had dynamic music. Now, I don't know if it was the first game with dynamic music or not, but it was dynamic music played via MIDI files, which allowed it to transition from one piece to another piece virtually seamlessly because it was all programming. And it's not something you could easily do today because you can't just mid note shift music that's been recorded and make it sound natural. There's always going to be some kind of disjointing effect that happens when one does that. So it's interesting the kinds of technologies that we had that still are possible today but aren't commonly done. Yeah, well, you shouldn't be trying to eat the spoon, little girl. I'm just moving you. Yeah, there we go. Now you're on my lap. Yeah, oh, yes. There's a good kitty cat. Hi, Stormcloud. But one of the first games with voiced dialogue and dynamic music And it still wasn't even really fully 3D. The original X-Wing was kind of a 2.5D game where the world was 3D, but the individual like targets and ships were mostly 2D for the first version of it. Then they did an updated version of it where they had 3D ships, and there's like three different versions. And you can get them all on like good old games these days, and if you can get them to run, it's an interesting experience. But it's you take a look at the video games that happen in that kind of 10-year period, and the jump is monumental. The jump is unreal in quality in a lot of respects. And then the next 10 years, like, still a huge leap, but I don't know if it was as monumental. I mean, you can argue, yeah, between 2002 and 2012, there was a huge jump in graphical fidelity and gameplay depth and everything like that. But the last 10 years, I feel like there's not been that much movement. Like, don't get me wrong, Alien Isolation, which I've been playing recently, versus the Dead Space remake. The Dead Space remake looks better, but Alien Isolation still looks really good in terms of how good the game looks. There's some textures that could be upgraded. There's some models that maybe could be enhanced. Maybe some, special graphical post-processing effects or what have you. But by and large, Alien Isolation still looks really good. Which is why it's silly to me when a game that is less than a decade old gets a remake, because it's like, well, okay. If you told me 20 years ago that a game that was 4 years old then was getting a remake, I'd be like, okay, yeah, I can see that. Graphics have changed dramatically in the last 4 years. And that really held true up till about, I'll say about the Xbox 360 era. Everything past that point, not huge in terms of graphical differences. Not that there weren't any, but it wasn't as substantial as it had been previously, in my opinion, at least. Nowadays, when remakes for recent games get bandied about, I'm just like, okay, which one's the new one? I'm not alone in that. Like, it's genuinely hard to tell sometimes when you're like, oh yeah, here's this new remake. Okay, which one's the new one? Which one's the old one? Like, what should I be impressed with graphically here? And I'm not saying that to, poo on the developers or the artists, because I'm sure they're doing a good job. It's just the difference between what makes something look good today versus what's made something look good 5-6 years ago is not as extreme as it was 10 or even 20 years ago. Because early 3D stuff, oh man, ugly as sin at this point. Because I remember having to put games down to like 640 by 480 in terms of resolution because my graphics card at the time couldn't handle it any higher than that. Never mind the fact that we didn't have monitors capable of going far above that in terms of clarity. High definition monitors are like they've been around for a long time now, but they're relatively recent in the realm of computer gaming. Anyway, I have rambled perhaps long enough. Let us begin. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Chapter 14. Some time elapsed before I learned the history of my friends. It was one which could not fail to impress itself deeply on my mind, unfolding as it did a number of circumstances, each interesting and wonderful, the one so utterly inexperienced as I was. The name of the old man was De Lacy. He was descended from a good family in France, where he had lived for many years in affluence, respected by his superiors and beloved by his equals. His son was bred in the service of his country, and Agatha had ranked with ladies of the highest distinction. A few months before my arrival, they had lived in a large and luxurious city called Paris, surrounded by friends, and possessed of every enjoyment which virtue, refinement, intellect, or taste, accompanied by a moderate fortune, could afford. The father of Safie had been the cause of their ruin. He was a Turkish merchant, and had inhabited Paris for many years, when, for some reason I could not learn, he became obnoxious to the government. He was seized and cast into prison the very day Safie arrived from Constantinople to join him. He was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of his sentence was very flagrant. All of Paris was indignant, and it was judged that his religion and wealth, rather than the crime alleged against him, had been the cause of his condemnation. Well then, Felix had accidentally been present at the trial. His horror and indignation were uncontrollable when he heard the decision of the court. He made, at that moment, a solemn vow to deliver him, and then looked around for the means. After many fruitless attempts to gain admittance to the prison, he found a strongly grated window in an unguarded part of the building which lighted the dungeon of the unfortunate. Huh. Well, okay then. I'm just gonna. The unfortunate Muslim who, loaded with chains, waited in despair the execution of the barbarous sentence. Felix visited the grate at night and made known to the prisoner his intentions in his favor. Just use his name. No. The man, amazed and delighted, endeavored to kindle the zeal of his deliverer by promises of reward and wealth. Felix rejected his offers with contempt. Yet when he saw the lovely Safie, who was allowed to visit her father, and who, by her gestures, expressed her lively gratitude, the youth could not help owning to his own mind that the captive possessed a treasure which would fully reward his toil and hazard. The man quickly perceived the impression that his daughter had made on the heart of Felix, and endeavored to secure him more entirely in his interests by the promise of her hand in marriage, so soon as he should be conveyed to a place of safety. Felix was too delicate to accept this offer, yet he looked forward to the probability of the event as to the consummation of his happiness. During the ensuing days, while the preparations were going forward for the escape of the merchant, the zeal of Felix was warmed by several letters that he received from this lovely girl, who found a means to express her thoughts in the language of her lover by the aid of an old man, a servant of her father, who understood French. She thanked him in the most ardent terms for his intended services toward her parent, and at the same time she greatly deplored her own fate. I have copies of these letters, for I found a means during my residence in the hovel to procure the implements of writing. The letters were often in the hands of Felix or Agatha. Before I depart, I will give them to you. They will prove the truth of my tale. But at present, the sun is already far declined. I shall only have time to repeat the substance of them to you. Safri related that her mother was Christian, seized and made a slave. Recommended by her beauty, she had won the heart of her father, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion, and taught her to aspire to higher powers of intellect and an independence of spirit. This lady died, but her lessons were indelibly impressed in the mind of Safie, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to her home and being. Okay. Yeah, I had a feeling we'd be touching on some more delicate subjects here. So there's a discussion here about, we'll just call it prejudices and uninformed information about how society outside of Europe worked. I had a feeling once the slave thing was brought up, that was going to be a thing. Let's see here. I'm just going to skip that section. Suffice to say that it is a bit infantilizing. The day for the execution of the merchant was fixed, but on the night previous to it, he quitted his prison, and before morning was distant many leagues from Paris. Felix had procured passports in the name of his father, sister, and himself. He had previously communicated his plan to the former, who aided the deceit by quitting his house under the pretense of a journey, and concealed himself with his daughter in an obscure part of Paris. Felix conducted the fugitives through France to Lyon, and across Mount Cenis to Leghorn, where the merchant had decided to wait a favorable opportunity of passing into some part of Turkey. Safie resolved to remain with her father until the moment of his departure, before which time the merchant renewed his promise that she should be united to his deliverer, and Felix remained with them in expectation of that event. And in the meantime he enjoyed the society of the merchant, who exhibited towards him the simplest and tender. Oh, sorry, of Safie, who exhibited towards him the simplest and tenderest affection. They conversed with one another through means of an interpreter, and sometimes with interpretation of looks, and Safie sang to him the divine airs of her native country. The merchant allowed this intimacy to take place, and encouraged the hopes of the youthful lovers, while in his heart he had formed far other plans. He loathed the idea of his daughter should be united to this man, but he feared the resentments of Felix if he should appear lukewarm, for he knew he was still in the power of his deliverer. If he should choose to betray him to the Italian state which they inhabited, he revolved 1,000 plans by which he should be enabled to prolong the deceit until it might no longer be necessary, and secretly take his daughter with him when he departed. His plans were facilitated by the news which arrived from Paris. The government of France were greatly enraged at the escape of their victim, and spared no pains to detect and punish his deliverer. The plot of Felix was quickly discovered, and De Lacy and Agatha were thrown into prison. The news reached Felix and roused him from his dream of pleasure. His blind and aged father and his gentle sister lay in a noisome dungeon, while he enjoyed the free air and the society of her whom he loved. This idea was torture to him. He quickly arranged with the merchant that if the latter should find a favorable opportunity for escape before Felix could return to Italy, Safie should remain as a boarder at a convent at Leghorn, and then, quitting Safie, he hastened to Paris, and delivered himself up to the vengeance of the law, hoping to free De Lacy and Agatha by this proceeding. He did not succeed. They remained confined for 5 months before the trial took place, the result of which deprived them of their fortune and condemned them to perpetual exile from their native country. They found a miserable asylum in the cottage in Germany where I discovered them. Felix soon learned that the treacherous merchant, whom he and his family had endured such unheard of impression, or whom he and his family endured such unheard of oppression, on discovering that his deliverer was thus reduced to poverty and ruin, became a traitor to good feeling and honor, and had quitted Italy with his daughter, insultingly sending Felix a pittance of money to aid him, as he said, in some plan of future maintenance. Such were the events that preyed on the heart of Felix, and rendered him, when I first saw him, the most miserable of his family. He could have endured poverty, and while this distress had been the meed of his virtue, he gloried in it. The ingratitude of the merchant, and the loss of his beloved Safie, were misfortunes more bitter and irreparable. The arrival of Safie now infused new life into his soul. The news reached Leghorn that Felix was deprived of his wealth and rank. The merchant commanded his daughter to think no more of her lover, but to prepare to return to her native country. The generous nature of Safie was outraged by this command. She attempted to expostulate with her father, but he left her angrily, reiterating his tyrannical mandate. A few days after, the merchant entered his daughter's apartment and told her hastily that he had reason to believe that his residence at Leghorn had been divulged, and that he should speedily be delivered up to the French government. He had, consequently, hired a vessel to convey him to Constantinople, for which city he should sail in a few hours. He intended to leave his daughter under the care of a confidential servant, to follow at her leisure with the greater part of his property, which had not yet arrived at Leghorn. When alone, Safie resolved in her own mind the plan of conduct that it would become to when alone, Safie resolved in her own mind the plan of conduct that it would become her to pursue in this emergency. A residence in Turkey was abhorrent to her. Her feelings were alike adverse to it. But some papers of her father which fell into her hands, she heard of the exile of her lover, and learnt the name of the spot where he then resided. She hesitated some time, but at length she formed her determination. Taking with her some jewels that belonged to her, and a sum of money, she quitted Italy with an attendant, a native of Leghorn, but who understood the common language of Turkey, and departed for Germany. She arrived in safety at a town around about 20 leagues from the cottage of De Lacy, when her attendant fell dangerously ill. Safie nursed her with the most devoted affection, but the poor girl died, and she was left alone, unacquainted with the language of the country, and utterly ignorant of the customs of the world. She fell, however, into good hands. The Italian had mentioned the name of the spot for which they were bound, and after her death, the woman of the house in which they had lived took care that Safie should arrive in safety at the cottage of her lover. End of chapter 14. We're just going to talk a moment about how there's some stereotypes in there. Uh, and the idea of harems. Now, I'm not fully qualified to talk about all this stuff, but uh, this is sensationalized nonsense for the vast majority of all we're talking about, if not all of it. This is just we heard stories and then repeated them, and that's how these things happened. And yeah, there's definitely a major like Mary Shelley did not go to a lot of these places and experience a lot of these things first person. So, you know, suffice to say, uh, man gets broken out of prison and betrays the person who broke him out is a nasty thing to do, especially when, you know, he was being set up to be killed for his religion, which also super messed up. But also, let's talk for a moment about the fact that old Felix here, like, look, okay, if you grow close to somebody during periods of stress and strife and conflict, that's one thing. But let's not get it twisted here. Seifi's father, the merchant, was in a bad situation. Would Felix have betrayed him if he was truthful with him? Probably not. Felix is willing to go to jail for this man. Felix is willing to give up his entire family's status and everything for it. Like, he was doing it because it was the right thing. This man was using his daughter as a bargaining chip, and that was a super shitty thing to do. Was it also shitty that maybe Felix was hoping that that would be the way things would work out? Little bit. Little bit. At the very least, the the way it's presented is that he refused the idea of Seifi being his wife because of this, which is way better, like way better than the alternative, which is you agreed and now so like it's shown that Seifi and Felix have an actual connection despite early on not being able to converse effectively. So like there's that. Way better than the alternative. And Seifi was at least attracted enough to Felix to basically take a bunch of her dad's money and say, screw it, I'm going to Germany. Now, all the other bits about religion and harems and all that, we're just going to breeze past that for a bit. Because also, the part about women holding station in Europe, I mean, yes, it's true. Don't get me wrong. It happened, you know. But Europe was also like, you know, put it mildly, there's more kings than queens, and so far all the popes are men. So, you know. Anyway, do you mind, miss? And since I'm also doing him, I will switch over to him because this is still his stuff. Old Adam. So chapter 15. Such was the history of my beloved cottagers. It impressed me deeply. I learned, from the views of social life which it developed, to admire their virtues and to deprecate the vices of mankind. As yet, I looked upon crime as a distant evil. Benevolence and generosity were ever present before me, inciting within me a desire to become an actor in the busy scene where so many admirable qualities were called forth and displayed. But, in giving an account of the progress of my intellect, I must not omit a circumstance which occurred in the beginning of the month of August of the same year. One night, during my accustomed visit to the neighboring wood, where I collected my own food and brought home firing for my protectors, I found on the ground a leather portmanteau containing several articles of dress and some books. I eagerly seized the prize and returned with it to my hovel. Fortunately, the books were written in the language the elements of which I had acquired at the cottage. They consisted of Paradise Lost, a volume of Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Werther. The possession of these treasures gave me extreme delight. I now continually studied and exercised my mind upon these histories, whilst my friends were employed in their ordinary occupations. I can hardly describe to you the effects of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. In The Sorrows of Werther, besides the interest of its simple and affecting story, so many opinions are canvassed, and so many lights thrown upon what had hitherto been to me obscure subjects, that I found in it a never-ending source of speculation and astonishment. The gentle and domestic manners it described, combined with lofty sentiments and feelings, which had for their object something out of self, accorded well with my experience among my protectors, and with the wants which were forever alive in my own bosom. But I thought Werther himself a more divine being than I had ever beheld or imagined. His character contained no pretension, but it sunk deep. Disquisitions upon death and suicide were calculated to fill me with wonder. I did not pretend to enter into the merits of the case, yet I inclined towards the opinions of the hero, whose extinction I wept, without precisely understanding it. As I read, however, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike to the beings concerning whom I read, and to whose conversation I was a listener. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but I was unformed in mind, as I was dependent on none and related to none. The path of my departure was free, and there was none to lament my annihilation. My person was hideous, and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. The volume of Plutarch's Lives which I possessed contained the histories of the first founders of the ancient republics. This book had a far different effect upon me than The Sorrows of Werther. I learned from Werther's imaginations despondency and gloom, but Plutarch taught me the high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections, to admire and love the heroes of past ages. Many things I read surpassed my understanding and experience. I had a very confused knowledge of kingdoms, wide extensive country, mighty rivers, and boundless seas. But I was perfectly unacquainted with towns and large assemblages of men. The cottage of my protectors had been the only school in which I had studied human nature, but this book developed new and mightier scenes of action. I read of men concerned in public affairs, governing or massacring their species. I felt the greatest ardor for virtue rise within me, the abhorrence for vice, as far as I understood the signification of those terms, relative as they were as I applied them, to pleasure and pain alone. Induced by these feelings, I was of course led to admire peaceable lawgivers, Numa, Solon, Lycurgus, in preference to Romulus and Theseus. The patriarchal lives of my protectors caused these impressions to take a firm hold in my mind. Perhaps, if my first introduction to humanity had been made by a young soldier burning for glory and slaughter, I should have been imbued with different sensations. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it, as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands, as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred to several situations, as the similarity struck me, to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. Another circumstance strengthened and confirmed these feelings. Soon after my arrival in the hovel, I discovered some papers in the pocket of the dress which I had taken from your laboratory. At first I had neglected them, but now that I was able to decipher the characters in which they were written, I began to study them with diligence. It was your journal of the 4 months that preceded my creation. You minutely described in these papers every step you took in the progress of your work. This history was mingled with accounts of domestic occurrences. You doubtless recall these papers. Here they are. Everything is related in them which bears reference to my accursed origin. The whole detail of that series of disgusting circumstances which produced it is set in view. The minutest description of my odious and loathsome person is given, in language which painted your own horrors and rendered mine indelible. I sickened as I read. Hateful day when I received life, I exclaimed in agony. Accursed creator! Why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust? God, in pity, made man beautiful and alluring after his own image. But my form is a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the very resemblance. Satan had his companions, fellow devils to admire and encourage him, but I am solitary and abhorred. These were the reflections of my hours of despondency and solitude. But when I contemplated the virtues of the cottagers, their amiable and benevolent dispositions, I persuaded myself that when they should become acquainted with my admiration of their virtues, they would compassionate me and overlook my personal deformity. Could they turn from their door one, however monstrous, who solicited their compassion and friendship? I resolved, at least, not to despair, but in every way to fit myself for an interview with them which would decide my fate. I postponed this attempt for some months longer, for the importance attached to its success inspired me with a dread lest I should fail. Besides, I found that my understanding improved so much with every day's experience that I was unwilling to commence this undertaking until a few more months should have added to my sagacity. Several changes in the meantime took place in the cottage. The presence of Safety diffused happiness among its inhabitants, and I also found that a greater degree of plenty reigned there. Felix and Agatha spent more time in amusement and conversation, and were assisted in their labors by servants. They did not appear rich, but they were contented and happy. Their feelings were serene and peaceful, while mine became every day more tumultuous. Increase of knowledge only discovered to me more clearly what a wretched outcast I was. I cherished hope, it is true, but it vanished when I beheld my person reflected in water, or my shadow in the moonside. Even as that frail image and that inconsistent shade. I endeavored to crush these fears and to fortify myself for the trial which in a few months I resolved to undergo. And sometimes I allowed my thoughts, unchecked by reason, to ramble in the fields of paradise, and dared to fancy amiable and lovely creatures sympathizing with my feelings, and cheering my gloom. Their angelic countenances breathed smiles of consolation. But it was all a dream. No Eve soothed my sorrows, nor shared my thoughts. I was alone. I remembered Adam's supplication to his Creator, but where was mine? He had abandoned me, and in the bitterness of my heart, I cursed him. Autumn passed thus. I saw with surprise and grief the leaves decay and fall, and nature again assumed the barren and bleak appearance it had worn when I first beheld the woods and the lovely moon. Yet I did not heed the bleakness of the weather. I was better fitted by my conformation for the endurance of cold than heat. But my chief delights were the sight of the flowers, the birds, and all the gay apparel of summer. When those deserted me, I turned with more attention towards the cottagers. Their happiness was not decreased by the absence of summer. They loved and sympathized with one another, and their joys, depending on each other, were not interrupted by the casualties that took place around them. The more I saw of them, the greater became my desire to claim their protection and kindness. My heart yearned to be known and loved by these amiable creatures. To see their sweet looks directed towards me with affection was the utmost limit of my ambition. I dared not think that they would turn them from me with disdain and horror. The poor that stopped at their door were never driven away. I asked, is it true? Are greater treasures than a little food or rest? I required kindness and sympathy, but I did not believe myself utterly unworthy of it. The winter advanced, and an entire revolution of the seasons had taken place since I awoke into life. My attention at this time was solely directed towards my plan of introducing myself to the cottage of my protectors. I revolved many projects, but that on which I finally fixed was to enter the dwelling when the blind old man should be alone. I had sagacity enough to discover that the unnatural hideousness of my person was the chief object of horror with those who had formerly beheld me. My voice, although harsh, had nothing terrible in it, I thought. Therefore, that if in the absence of his children I could gain the goodwill and mediation of old De Lacy, I might, by his means, be tolerated by my younger protectors. One day, when the sun shone on the red leaves that strewed the ground and diffused cheerfulness, although it denied warmth, Safie, Agatha, and Felix departed on a long country walk, and the old man, at his own desire, was left alone in the cottage. When his children had departed, he took up his guitar and played several mournful but sweet airs, more sweet and mournful than I had ever heard him play before. At first his countenance was illuminated with pleasure, but, as he continued, thoughtfulness and sadness succeeded. At length, laying aside the instrument, he sat absorbed in reflection. My heart beat quick. This was the hour and moment of trial which would decide my hopes or realize my fears. The servants were gone to a neighboring fair. All was silent in and around the cottage. It was an excellent opportunity, yet, when I had proceeded to execute my plan, my limbs failed me, and I sank to the ground. Again I rose, exerting all the firmness with which I master, removed the planks which I had placed before my hovel to conceal my retreat. The fresh air revived me, and with renewed determination, I approached the door of their cottage. I knocked. "Who is there?" said the old man. "Come in." I entered. "Pardon this intrusion," said I. "I am a traveler in want of a little rest. You would greatly oblige me if you would allow me to remain a few minutes before the fire." "Enter," said De Lacy, "and I will try in what manner I can to relieve your wants, but, unfortunately, my children are from home, and as I am blind, I am afraid I shall find it difficult to procure food for you." "Do not trouble yourself, my kind host. I have food. It is warmth and rest only that I need." I sat down, and a silence ensued. I knew that every minute was precious to me, yet I remained resolute in what manner to commence the interview, when the old man addressed me. "By your language, stranger, I suppose you are my countrymen. Are you French?" "No, but I was educated by a French family and understand that language only. I am now going to claim the protection of some friends whom I sincerely love and whose favor I have some hopes." "Are they Germans?" "No, they are French. But let us change the subject. I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around, and I have no relation or friend upon earth. These amiable people to whom I go have never seen me, and know little of me. I am full of fears, for if I fail there, I am an outcast in the world forever." "Do not despair. To be friendless is indeed to be unfortunate, but the hearts of men, when unprejudiced by any obvious self-interest, are full of brotherly love and charity. Rely, therefore, on your hopes, and if these friends are good and amiable, do not despair." "They are kind. They are the most excellent creatures in the world, but, unfortunately, they are prejudiced against me. I have good dispositions, my life has been hitherto harmless, and in some degree beneficial. But a fatal prejudice clouds their eyes, and where they ought to see a feeling and kind friend, they behold only a detestable monster."
"Well, that is indeed unfortunate. But if you are really blameless, cannot you undeceive them?"
"I am about to undertake that task."
and it is on that account that I feel so many overwhelming terrors. I tenderly love these friends, and I have, unknown to them, been for many months in the habits of daily kindness towards them. For they believe I wish to injure them, and it is that prejudice which I wish to overcome. Where do these friends reside? Near this spot. The old man paused and then continued. If you will unreservedly confide to me the particulars of your tale, I perhaps may be in use of undeceiving them. I am blind, and cannot judge of your countenance, but there is something in your words which persuades me that you are sincere. I am poor and in exile, but it will afford me true pleasure to be in any way serviceable to a human creature. Excellent man. I thank you and accept your generous offer. You raise me from the dust by this kindness, and I trust that by your aid I shall not be driven from the society and sympathy of your fellow creatures. Oh, heaven forbid! Even if you were really a criminal, for that can only drive you to desperation, and not instigate you to virtue. I am also unfortunate. I and my family have been condemned, although innocent. Judge, therefore, if I do not feel for your misfortunes. How can I thank you, my best and only benefactor? From your lips first have I heard the voice of kindness directed towards me. I shall be forever grateful, and your present humanity assures me of success with those friends whom I am on the point of meeting. May I know the names and residence of those friends? I paused. This, I thought, was the moment of decision, which was to rob me of or bestow happiness on me forever. I struggled vainly for firmness sufficient to answer him, for the effort destroyed all my remaining strength. I sank on the chair and sobbed aloud. At that moment I heard the steps of my younger protectors. I had not a moment to lose, but seizing the hand of the old man, I cried, "Now is the time. Save and protect me. You and your family are the friends whom I seek. Do not you desert me in the hour of trial." Great God! Exclaimed the old man. Who are you? At that instant, the cottage door was opened, and Felix, Safie, and Agatha entered. Who can describe their horror and consternation on beholding me? Agatha fainted, and Safie, unable to attend to her friend, rushed out of the cottage. Felix darted forward, and with supernatural force tore me from his father, to whose knees I clung. In a transport of fury, he dashed me to the ground and struck me violently with a stick. I could have torn him limb from limb, as the lion rends the antelope. But my heart sunk with me, as a bitter sickness, and I refrained. I saw him on the point of repeating his blow when, overcome with pain and anguish, I quitted the cottage, and the general tumult escaped unperceived to my hovel. The end of chapter 15. We will take a brief ad break here. Refill your waters, go to the bathroom, do whatever it is you need to do, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. See you soon. are back. Fortunately, or hopefully, we're at the end of the section of the book where I have to edit so much, but we'll see what happens.
It's not time for dinner yet, little girl. Calm down. All right. Chapter 16. Cursed creator. Why did I live? Why, in that instant, did I not extinguish the spark of existence which you had so wantonly bestowed? I know not. Despair had not yet taken possession of me. My feelings were those of rage and revenge. I could with pleasure have destroyed the cottage and its inhabitants, and have glutted myself with their shrieks and misery. When the night came, I quitted my retreat and wandered in the wood. Now, no longer restrained by the fear of discovery, I gave vent to my anguish in fearful howlings. I was like a wild beast that had broken the toils, destroying the objects that obstructed me, and ranging through the wood with a stag-like swiftness. Oh, what a miserable night I passed! Those cold stars shone in mockery, and the bare trees waved their branches above me. Now and then the sweet voice of a bird burst forth amidst the universal stillness. All, save I, were at rest or in enjoyment. I, like the arch-fiend, bore a hell within me, and, finding myself unsympathized with, wished to tear up the trees, spread havoc and destruction around me, and then to have sat down and enjoyed the ruin. But this was a luxury of sensation I could not endure. I became fatigued with excess of bodily exertion, and sank on the damp grass in the sick impotence of despair. There was none among the myriads of men that existed who would pity or assist me. And should I feel kindness towards my enemies? No. In that moment I declared everlasting war against the species and, more than all, against him who had formed me and sent me forth into this insupportable misery. The sun rose. I heard the voices of men, and knew that it was impossible to return to my retreat during that day. Accordingly, I hid myself in some thick underwood, determining to devote the ensuing hours to reflection on my situation. The pleasant sunshine and the pure air of day restored me to some degree of tranquillity, and when I considered what had passed at the cottage, I could not help believing that I had been too hasty in my conclusions. I had certainly acted imprudently. It was apparent that my conversation had interested the father in my behalf, and I was a fool in having exposed my person to the horror of his children. I had to have familiarized the old De Lacy to me, and by degrees to have discovered myself to the rest of the family, and they should have been prepared for my approach. But I did not believe my errors to be irretrievable, and, after much consideration, I resolved to return to the cottage, seek the old man, and by my representations with him to my party. These thoughts calmed me, and in the afternoon I sank into a profound sleep. But the fever of my blood did not allow me to be visited by peaceful dreams. The horrible scene of the preceding day was forever acting before my eyes. The females were flying, and the enraged Felix tearing me from his father's feet. I awoke, exhausted, and finding that it was already night, I crept forth from my hiding place, and went in search of food. When my hunger was appeased, I directed my steps towards the well-known path that conducted to the cottage. All there was at peace. I crept into my hovel, and remained in silent expectation of the accustomed hour when the family arose. That hour passed. The sun mounted high in the heavens, but the cottagers did not appear. I trembled violently, apprehending some dreadful misfortune.
The inside of the cottage was dark, and I heard no motion. Cannot describe the agony of this suspense. Presently 2 countrymen passed by, but pausing near the cottage, they entered into conversation using violent gesticulations. I did not understand what they said, as they spoke the language of the country, which differed from that of my protectors. Soon after, however, Felix approached with another man. I was surprised, as I knew that he had not quitted the cottage that morning, and waited anxiously to discover from his discourse the meaning of these unusual appearances.
"Do you consider," said his companion to him, "that you will be obliged to pay 3 months' rent and to lose the produce of your garden? I do not wish to take any unfair advantage, and I beg therefore that you will take some days to consider your determination." "It is utterly useless," replied Felix. "We can never again inhabit your cottage. The life of my father is in the greatest danger, owing to the dreadful circumstance that I have related. My wife and sister will never recover their horror. I entreat you to not reason with me any more. Take possession of your tenement, and let me fly from this place."
Felix trembled violently when he said this. He and his companions entered the cottage, in which they remained for a few minutes, and then departed. I never saw any of the family of Lacey more. I continued for the remainder of the day in my hovel in a state of utter and stupid despair. My protectors had departed, and had broken the only link that held me to the world. For the first time, the feelings of revenge and hatred filled my bosom, and I did not strive to control them, but, allowing myself to be borne away by the stream, I bent my mind towards injury and death. When I thought of my friends, the mild voice of De Lacy, the gentle eyes of Agatha, and the exquisite beauty of Safie, these thoughts vanished. A gush of tears somewhat soothed me. But again, when I reflected that they had spurned and deserted me, anger returned, the rage of anger, and unable to injure anything human, I turned my fury towards inanimate objects. As night advanced, I placed a variety of combustibles around the cottage, and, after having destroyed every vestige of cultivation in the garden, I waited with forced impatience until the moon had sunk to commence my operations. As the night advanced, a fierce wind arose from the woods and quickly dispersed the clouds that had loitered in the heavens. The blast tore along like a mighty avalanche, and produced a kind of insanity in my spirits that burst all bounds of reason and reflection. I lighted the dry branch of a tree, and danced with fury around the devoted cottage, my eyes still fixed on the western horizon, the edge of which the moon nearly touched. As part of its orb was at length hid, and I waved my brand, it sunk, and, with a loud scream, I fired the straw and heath and bushes which I had collected. The wind fanned the fire, and the cottage was quickly enveloped by the flames which clung to it and licked it with their forked and destroying tongues. As soon as I was convinced that no assistance could save any part of the habitation, I quitted the scene and sought for refuge in the woods. And now, with the world before me, whither should I bend my steps? I resolved to fly far from the scene of my misfortunes, but to me, hated and despised, every country must be equally horrible. At length, the thought of you crossed my mind. I learned from your papers that you were my father, my creator, and to whom I could apply with more fitness than to him who had given me life. Among the lessons that Felix had bestowed upon Safie, geography had not been omitted. I had learned from these the relative situations of the different countries of the earth. You had mentioned Geneva as the name of your native town, and towards this place I resolved to proceed. But how was I to direct myself? I knew that I must travel in a southwesterly direction to reach my destination, for the sun was my only guide. I did not know the names of the towns that I was to pass through, nor could I ask information from a single human being. But I did not despair. From you only could I hope for succor, although towards you I felt no sentiment but that of hatred. Unfeeling, heartless creator, you had endowed me with perceptions and passions, and then cast me abroad for an object for the scorn and horror of mankind. But on you only had I any claim for pity and redress. And from you I determined to seek that justice which I vainly attempted to gain from any other being that wore the human form. My travels were long, and the sufferings I endured intense. It was late in autumn when I quitted the district where I had so long resided. I traveled only at night, fearful of encountering the visage of a human being. Nature decayed around me, and the sun became heatless. Rain and snow poured around me, mighty rivers were frozen, the surface of the earth was hard and chill and bare, and I found no shelter. Oh, earth! How often did I imprecate curses on the cause of my being? The mildness of my nature had fled, and all within me was turned to gall and bitterness. The nearer I approached your habitation, the more deeply did I feel the spirit of revenge enkindled in my heart. Snow fell, and the waters were hardened, but I rested not. A few incidents now and then directed me, and I possessed a map of the country, but I often wandered wide from my path. The agony of my feelings allowed me no respite. No incident occurred from which my rage and misery could not extract its food, but a circumstance that happened when I arrived on the confines of Switzerland, and the sun had recovered its warmth, and the earth began to look green, confirmed in a special manner the bitterness and horror of my feelings. I generally rested during the day, and traveled only when I was secured by night from the view of man. One morning, however, finding that my path lay through a deep wood, I ventured to continue my journey after the sun had risen. The day, which was one of the first of spring, cheered even me by the loveliness of its sunshine and the balminess of the air. I felt emotions of gentleness and pleasure, that had long appeared dead, revive within me. Half surprised by the novelty of these sensations, I allowed myself to be borne away by them, forgetting my solitude and deformity, dared to be happy. Soft tears again bedewed my cheeks, and I even raised my humid eyes with thankfulness towards the blessed sun, which bestowed such joy upon me. Damn, Adam really said praise the sun. I continued to wind among the paths of the wood until I came to its boundary, which was skirted by a deep and rapid river, into which many of the trees bent their branches, now budding with the fresh spring. Here I paused, not exactly knowing what path to pursue, when I heard the sound of voices that induced me to conceal myself under the shade of a cypress. I was scarcely hid when a young girl came running towards the spot where I was concealed, laughing as if she ran from someone in sport. She continued her course along the precipitous sides of the river, when suddenly her foot slipped, and she fell into the rapid stream. I rushed from my hiding place, and with extreme labor from the force of current, saved her, and dragged her to shore. She was senseless, and I endeavored by every means in my power to restore animation, when I was suddenly interrupted by the approach of a rustic, who was probably a person from whom she playfully fled. On seeing me, he darted towards me, tearing the girl from my arms, hastened towards the deeper parts of the woods. I followed speedily. I hardly knew why, but when the man saw me draw near, he aimed a gun which he carried at my body and fired. I sunk to the ground, and my injurer, with increased swiftness, escaped into the wood. This was then the reward of my benevolence. I had saved a human being from destruction, but as a recompense, I now writhed under a miserable pain of a wound which shattered the flesh and bone. The feelings of kindness and gentleness which I had entertained but a few moments before gave place to the hellish rage and gnashing of teeth. Inflamed by pain, I vowed eternal hatred and vengeance to all mankind. But the agony of my wound overcame me. My pulses paused, and I fainted. For some weeks, I led a miserable life in the woods, endeavoring to cure the wound which I had received. The ball had entered my shoulder, and I knew not whether it had remained there or passed through. At any rate, I had no means of extracting it. My sufferings were augmented also by the oppressive sense of the injustice and ingratitude of their infliction. My daily vows rose for revenge, a deep and deadly revenge, such as would alone compensate for the outrages and anguish I had endured. After some weeks, my wound healed, and I continued my journey. The labors I endured were no longer to be alleviated by the bright sun or gentle breezes of spring. All joy was but a mockery, which insulted my desolate state, and made me feel more painfully that I was not made for the enjoyment of pleasure. But now my toils drew near to a close, and in 2 months from this time I reached the environs of Geneva. It was evening when I arrived, and I retired to a hiding place among the fields that surround it, to meditate in what manner I should apply to you. I was oppressed by fatigue and hunger, and far too unhappy to enjoy the gentle breezes of evening, or the prospect of the sun setting behind the stupendous mountains of Jura. At this time, a slight sleep relieved me from the pain of reflection, which was disturbed by the approach of a beautiful child, who came running into the recess I had chosen, with all the sportiveness of infancy. Suddenly, as I gazed on him, an idea seized me, that this little creature was unprejudiced, and had lived too short a time to have imbibed a horror of deformity. If, therefore, I could seize him and educate him as my companion and friend, I should not be so desolate in this peopled earth. Urged by this impulse, I seized on the boy as he passed and drew him towards me. As soon as he beheld my form, he placed his hands before his eyes and uttered a shrill scream. He drew his hand forcibly from his face and said, "Child, what is the meaning of this? I do not intend to hurt you. Listen to me." He struggled violently. "Let me go!" cried. "Monster, ugly wretch, you wish to eat me and tear me to pieces. You are an ogre. Let me go, or I will tell my papa." "Boy, you will never see your father again. You must come with me." "Hideous monster, let me go. My papa is a syndic. He is Monsieur Frankenstein. He will punish you. You dare not keep me." "Frankenstein? You belong, then, to my enemy, to him towards whom I have sworn eternal revenge. You shall be my first victim." The child still struggled, and loaded me with epithets which carried despair to my heart. I grasped his throat to silence him. In a moment, he lay dead at my feet. I gazed upon my victim. My heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. Clapping my hands, I exclaimed, "I, too, can create desolation. My enemy is not invulnerable. This death will carry despair to him, and 1,000 other miseries shall torment and destroy him." As I fixed my eyes on the child, I saw something glittering on his breast. I took it. It was a portrait of a most lovely woman. In spite of my malignity, it softened and attracted me. For a few moments I gazed with delight in her dark eyes, fringed by deep lashes, and her lovely lips. But presently my rage returned, and I remembered that I was forever deprived of the delights of such beautiful creatures could bestow, and that she whose resemblance I contemplated would, in regarding me, have changed that air of divine benignity to one expressive of disgust and affright. Can you wonder that such thoughts transported me with rage? I only wonder at that moment, instead of venting my sensations in exclamations and agony, I did not rush among mankind and perish in the attempt to destroy them. While I was overcome by these feelings, I left the spot where I had committed the murder, and, seeking a more secluded hiding place, entered a barn which had appeared to me to be empty. A woman was sleeping on some straw. She was young, not indeed so beautiful as her whose portraits I held, but of an agreeable aspect, and blooming in the loveliness of youth and health. Here, I thought, is the one whose joy-imparting smiles are bestowed on all but me. And then I bent over her, and whispered, "Awake, fairest, thy lover is near. He who would give his life but to obtain one look of affection from thine eyes. My beloved, awake." The sleeper stirred. A thrill of terror ran through me. Should she indeed awake and see me, and curse me, and denounce the murderer? Thus she would assuredly act if her darkened eyes opened and she beheld me. The thought was madness. It stirred the fiend within me. Not I, but she shall suffer. The murder I have committed because I am forever robbed of all that she could give me. She shall atone. The crime had its source in her. Be hers the punishment. Thanks to the lesson of Felix and the sanguinary laws of man, I had learned now to work mischief. I bent over her and placed the portrait securely in one of the folds of her dress. She moved again, and I fled. For some days I haunted the spot where these scenes had taken place, sometimes wishing to see you, sometimes resolved to quit the world and its miseries forever. At length I wandered towards these mountains, and have ranged through their immense recesses, consumed by a burning passion which you alone can gratify. We may not part until you have promised to comply with my requisition. I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me, but one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create. The end of chapter 16. Oh. So it's implied in this then that his finding of the woman who was framed for the crime was accidental, but it actually caused more pain to Victor than it would have been had he just picked anyone at random. Him finding Victor's younger brother was itself accidental, but once he found out it was Victor's brother, well, that was kind of it. All right, let's see here. Chapter 17. The being finished speaking and fixed his looks upon me in expectation of a reply. But I was bewildered, perplexed, and unable to arrange my ideas sufficiently to understand the full extent of his proposition. He continued, "You must create a female for me, with whom I can live in the interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being. This you alone can do, and I demand it of you as right which you must not refuse to concede.
The latter part of his tale had kindled anew in me the anger that had died away while he narrated his peaceful life among the cottagers, and, as he said this, I could no longer suppress the rage that burned within me. "I do refuse it," I replied, "and no torture shall ever extort a consent from me. You may render me the most miserable of men, but you shall never make me base my own eyes. Shall I create another like yourself, whose joint wickedness might desolate the world? Begone! I have answered you, and you may torture me, but I will never consent."
"You are in the wrong," replied the fiend, "and instead of threatening, I am content to reason with you. I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all of mankind? You, my creator, would tear me to pieces and triumph. Remember that. And tell me why I should pity man more than he pities me. You would not call it murder if you could precipitate me into one of those ice rifts and destroy my frame, the works of your own hands. Shall I respect man when he contemns me? Let him live with me in the interchange of kindness, and instead of injury, I would bestow every benefit upon him with tears of gratitude at his acceptance. But that cannot be. The human senses are insurmountable barriers to our union. Yet mine shall not be the submission of abject slavery. I will revenge my injuries. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, and chiefly towards you, my archenemy. Because my creator, I do swear inextinguishable hatred. Have a care. I will work at your destruction, nor finish until I desolate your heart, so that you shall curse the hour of your birth." A fiendish rage animated him as he said this. His face was wrinkled into contortions too horrible for human eyes to behold, but presently he calmed himself and proceeded. "I intended to reason. This passion is detrimental to me, for you do not reflect that you are the cause of its excess. If any being felt emotions of benevolence towards me, I should return them 100 and 100-fold. For that one creature's sake, I would make peace with the whole kind. But I now indulge in dreams of bliss that cannot be realized. What I ask of you is reasonable and moderate. I demand a creature of another sex, but as hideous as myself. The gratification is small, but it is all that I can receive, and it shall content me. It is true we shall be monsters, cut off from all the world, but on that account we shall be more attached to one another. Our lives will not be happy, but they will be harmless and free from the misery I now feel. Oh, my Creator, make me happy. Let me feel gratitude towards you for one benefit. Let me see that I excite the sympathy of some existing thing. Do not deny me my request."
I was moved. I shuddered when I thought of the possible consequences of my consent, but I felt that there was some justice in his argument. His tale and the feelings he now expressed proved him to be a creature of fine sensations. And did I not, as his maker, owe him all the portion of happiness that it was in my power to bestow? He saw my change of feeling and continued.
"If you consent, neither you nor any other human being shall ever see us again. I will go to the vast wilds of South America. My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid to glut my appetite. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. My companion will be of the same nature as myself, and will be content with the same fare. We shall make our bed of dried leaves. The sun will shine on us as on man, and will ripen our food. The picture I present to you is peaceful and human. You must feel that you could deny it only in the wantonness of power and cruelty. Pitiless as you have been towards me, I now see compassion in your eyes. Let me seize the favorable moment and persuade you to promise what I so ardently desire.
You propose, replied I, to fly from the habitations of man, to dwell in those wilds where the beasts of the field will be your only companions? How can you, who long for the love and sympathy of man, persevere in this exile? You will return, and again seek their kindness, and you will meet their and you will meet with their detestation. Your evil passions will be renewed, and you will then have a companion to aid you in the task of destruction. This may not be. Cease to argue the point, for I cannot consent.
How inconsistent are your feelings? But a moment ago you were moved by my representations. And why do you again harden yourself to my complaints? I swear to you, by the earth which I inhabit, and by you that made me, that with the companion you bestow I will quit the neighborhood of man, and dwell as it may chance in the most savage of places. My evil passions will have fled, for I shall meet with sympathy. My life will flow quietly away, and in my dying moments I shall not curse my Maker.
His words had a strange effect upon me. I compassionated him, and sometimes felt a wish to console him, but when I looked upon him, when I saw the filthy mass that moved and talked, my heart sickened, and my feelings were altered to those of horror and hatred. I tried to stifle these sensations. I thought that, as I could not sympathize with him, I had no right to withhold from him the small portion of happiness which was yet in my power to bestow. You swear, I said, to be harmless. But have you not already shown a degree of malice that should reasonably make me distrust you? May not even this be a feint that will increase your triumph by affording a wider scope for your revenge?
How is this? I must not be trifled with. I demand an answer. If I have no ties and no affections, hatred and vice must be my portion. The love of another will destroy the cause of my crimes, and I shall become a thing whose existence everyone will be ignorant. My vices are the children of a forced solitude that I abhor, and my virtues will necessarily arise when I live in communion with an equal. I shall feel the affections of a sensitive being, and, becoming linked to the chain of existence and events from which I am now excluded.
I paused some time to reflect on all that he had related, and the various arguments which he had employed. I thought of the promise of virtues which he had displayed in the opening of his existence, and the subsequent blight of all kindly feeling by the loathing and scorn which his protectors had manifested toward him. His power and threats were not omitted in my calculations. A creature who could exist in the ice caves of the glaciers and hide himself from pursuit among the ridges of inaccessible precipices was a being possessing faculties it would be vain to cope with. After a long pause of reflection, I concluded that the justice due both him and my fellow creatures demanded of me that I should comply with his request. Turning to him, therefore, I said, I consent to your demand, on your solemn oath to quit Europe forever, and every other place in the neighborhood of man, as soon as I shall deliver into your hands a female who will accompany you in your exile.
I swear, he cried, by the sun and the blue sky of heaven, and by the fire of love that burns in my heart, that if you grant my prayer, while they exist, you shall never behold me again. Depart to your home, and commence your labors. I shall watch their progress with unutterable anxiety, and fear not, but that when you return, but that when you are ready, I shall appear.
Saying this, he suddenly quitted me, fearful perhaps of any change in my sentiments. I saw him descend the mountain with greater speed than the flight of an eagle, and quickly lost among the undulations of the sea of ice. His tale had occupied the whole day, and the sun was upon the verge of the horizon when he departed. I knew that I ought to hasten my descent towards the valley, as I should soon be encompassed in darkness, but my heart was heavy, and my steps slow. The labor of winding among the little paths of the mountains and fixing my feet firmly as I advanced perplexed me, occupied as I was by the emotions which the occurrences of the day had produced. Night was far advanced when I came to the halfway resting place and seated myself beside the fountain. The stars shone at intervals as the clouds passed from over them. The dark pines rose before me, and every here and there a broken tree lay on the ground. It was a scene of wonderful solemnity, and stirred strange thoughts within me. I wept bitterly, and clasping my hands in agony, I exclaimed, "Oh, stars and clouds and winds, ye are all about to mock me. If ye really pity me, trust sensation and memory, let me become as naught. But if not, depart, depart, and leave me in my darkness." These were wild and miserable thoughts, but I cannot describe to you how the eternal twinkling of the stars weighed upon me, and how I listened to every blast of wind as if it were a dull, ugly siroc on its way to consume me. Morning dawned before I arrived at the village of Chameau. I took no rest, but returned immediately to Geneva. Even in my own heart, I could give no expression to my sensations. They weighed on me with a mountain's weight, and in their excess destroyed my agony beneath them. Thus I returned home, and entering the house, presented myself to the family. My haggard and wild appearance awoke intense alarm, but I answered no question, scarcely did I speak. I felt as if I was placed under a ban, as if I had no right to claim their sympathies, as if never more might I enjoy companionship with them. Yet, even thus I loved them to adoration, and to save them, I resolved to dedicate myself to my most abhorred task. The prospect of such an occupation made every other circumstance of existence pass before me like a dream, and that thought only had to me the reality of life. End of chapter 17. Hello, Neon. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. We're at the point where a decision must be made. Will young Victor do as he is bade? Or will Adam's rage overwhelm him? Doing well myself. Having some fun reading the book, avoiding a couple of surprises here and there. There's a reason for the pinned message, after all. Well, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. It is my hope that people tune in, listen, maybe fall asleep, or become entranced by the tale. I wasn't expecting like 5 chapters of reading as Adam, but here we are. All right. Chapter 18. Day after day, week after week passed away on my return to Geneva. I could not collect the courage to recommence my work. I feared the vengeance of the disappointed fiend, yet I was unable to overcome my repugnance to the task which was enjoined me. I found that I could not compose a female without again devoting several months to profound study and laborious disquisition. I had heard of some discoveries having been made by an English philosopher, the knowledge of which was material to my success, and I sometimes thought of obtaining my father's consent to visit England for this purpose, but I clung to every pretense of delay and shrunk from taking the first step in an undertaking whose immediate necessity began to appear less absolute to me. A change indeed had taken place in me. My health, which had hitherto declined, was now much restored, and my spirits, when unchecked by the memory of my unhappy promise, rose proportionately. My father saw this change with pleasure, and he turned his thoughts towards the best method of eradicating the remains of my melancholy, which every now and then would return by fits, and with a devouring blackness overcast the approaching sunshine. At these moments, I took refuge in the most perfect solitude. I passed whole days on the lake alone in the little boat, watching the clouds and listening to the rippling of the waves, silent and listless. But the fresh air and bright sun seldom failed to restore me to some degree of composure, and, on my return, I met the salutations of my friends with a readier smile and a more cheerful heart. It was after my return from one of these rambles that my father, calling me aside, thus addressed me. I am happy to remark, my dear son, that you have resumed your former pleasures, and seem to be returning to yourself. And yet you are still unhappy, and still avoid our society. For some time I was lost in conjecture as to the cause of this, but yesterday an idea struck me, and, if it is well founded, I conjure you to avow it. Reserve on such a point would not only be useless, but draw down terrible misery on all of us. I trembled violently at his exhortation. My father continued, I confess, my son, that I have always looked forward to your marriage with our dear Elizabeth as the tie of our domestic comfort and the stay of my declining years. You were attached to each other from your earliest infancy. You studied together and appeared in dispositions and tastes entirely suited to one another. But so blind is the experience of man that what I conceived to be the best assistance to my plan may have entirely destroyed it. You perhaps regard her as your sister, without any wish that she might become your wife. Nay, you may have met with another whom you may love, and considering yourself as bound in honor to Elizabeth, the struggle may occasion the poignant misery which you appear to feel. My dear father, reassure yourself. I love my cousin tenderly and sincerely. I never saw any woman who excited as Elizabeth does my warmest admiration and affection. My future hopes and prospects are entirely bound up in the expectation of our union.
The expression of your sentiments on this subject, my dear Victor, gives me more pleasure than I have for some time experienced. If you feel thus, then we shall assuredly be happy, however present events may cast gloom over us. But it is this gloom which appears to have taken so strong a hold of your mind that I wish to dissipate. Tell me, therefore, whether you object to an immediate solemnization of the marriage. We have been unfortunate, and recent events have drawn us from that everyday tranquillity befitting my years and infirmities. You are younger, yet I do not suppose, possessed as you are of competent fortune, that an early marriage would at all interfere with any future plans of honor and utility that you may have formed. Do not suppose, however, that I wish to dictate happiness to you, or that a delay on your part would cause me any serious uneasiness. Interpret my words with candor, and answer me, I conjure you, with confidence and sincerity.
I listened to my father in silence, and remained for some time incapable of offering any reply. I revolved rapidly in my mind a multitude of thoughts, and endeavored to arrive at some conclusion. Alas, to me the idea of an immediate union with my Elizabeth was one of horror and dismay. I was bound by a solemn promise, which I had not yet fulfilled, and dared not break, or, if I did, what manifold miseries might not impend over me and my devoted family. Could I enter into a festival with this deadly weight yet hanging round my neck, and bowing me to the ground? I must perform my engagement, and let the monster depart with his mate before I allowed myself to enjoy the delight of a union from which I expected peace. I remembered also the necessity imposed upon me of either journeying to England or entering into a long correspondence with those philosophers of that country, whose knowledge and discoveries were of indispensable use to me in my present undertaking. The latter method of obtaining the desired intelligence was dilatory and unsatisfactory. Besides, I had an insurmountable aversion to the idea of engaging myself in my loathsome task in my father's house, while in the habits of familiar intercourse with those I loved. I knew that 1,000 fearful accidents might occur, the slightest of which could dislocate a tale of thrill all connected with me with horror. I was aware that I should also often lose all self-command, all capacity of hiding the harrowing sensations that would possess me during the progress of my unearthly occupation. I must absent myself from all I loved while thus employed. Once commenced, it would quickly be achieved, and I might be restored to my family in peace and happiness. The promise fulfilled, the monster would depart forever, or, so my fond fancy imagined, some accident might meanwhile occur to destroy him, and put an end to my slavery forever. These feelings dictated my answer to my father. I expressed a wish to visit England, but, concealing the true reasons of this request, I clothed my desires under a guise which excited no suspicion, while I urged my desire with an earnestness that easily induced my father to comply. After so long a period of absorbing melancholy that resembled madness in its intensity and effects, he was glad to find that I was capable of taking pleasure in the idea of such a journey, and he hoped that a change of scene and varied amusement would, before my return, have restored me entirely to myself. The duration of my absence was left to my own choice. A few months, or at most a year, was the period contemplated. One paternal kind precaution he had taken to ensure my having a companion. Without previously communicating with me, he had, in concert with Elizabeth, arranged that Clerval should join me at Strasbourg. This interfered with the solitude I coveted for the prosecution of my task, yet at the commencement of my journey the presence of my friend could in no way be an impediment, and I truly rejoiced that thus I should be saved many hours of lonely, maddening reflection. Nay, Henry might stand between me and the intrusion of my foe. If I were alone, would he not at times force his abhorred presence on me, to remind me of my task or to contemplate its progress? To England, therefore, I was bound, and it was understood that my union with Elizabeth should take place immediately on my return. My father's age rendered him extremely averse to delay. For myself, there was one reward I promised myself for my detested toils, one consolation for my unparalleled sufferings. It was that the prospect of that day when, enfranchised by my miserable slavery, I might claim Elizabeth and forget the past in my union with her. I now made arrangements for my journey, but one feeling haunted me, which filled me with fear and agitation. During my absence, I should leave my friends unconscious to the existence of their enemy, and unprotected from his attacks, exasperated as he might be by my departure. But he had promised to follow me wherever I might go, and would he not accompany me to England? This imagination was dreadful in itself, but soothing, inasmuch as it supposed the safety of my friends. I was agonized with the idea of the possibility that the reverse of this might happen. But through the whole period during which I was slave of my creature, I allowed myself to be governed by the impulses of the moment, and my present sensations strongly intimated that the fiend would follow me, and exempt my family from the danger of his machinations. It was in the latter end of September that I again quitted my native country. My journey had been my own suggestion, and Elizabeth therefore acquiesced, but she was filled with disquiet at the idea of my suffering away from her, the inroads of misery and grief. It had been her care which had provided me a companion in Clerval, and yet a man is blind to 1,000 minute circumstances which call forth a woman's sedulous attention. She longed to bid me hasten my return, 1,000 conflicting emotions rendering her mute as she bade me a silent farewell. I threw myself into the carriage that was to convey me away, hardly knowing whither I was going, and careless of what was passing around. I remembered only, and it was a bit with a bitter anguish that I reflected on it, order that my chemical instruments should be packed to go with me. Filled with dreary imaginations, I passed through many beautiful and majestic scenes, but my eyes were fixed and unobserving. I could only think of the bourne of my travels, and the work which was to occupy me whilst they endured. After some days spent in listless indolence, during which I travelled many leagues, I arrived at Strasbourg, where I waited 2 days for Clerval. He came. Alas, how great was the contrast between us! He was alive to every new scene, joyful when he saw the beauties of the setting sun, and more happy when he beheld its rise, and recommence a new day. He pointed out to me the shifting colors of the landscape and the appearance of the sky. "This is what it is to live," he cried. "Now I enjoy existence. But you, my dear Frankenstein, wherefore are you desponding and sorrowful?" In truth, I was occupied by gloomy thoughts, and neither saw the descent of the evening star nor the golden sunrise reflected in the Rhine. And you, my friend, would be far more amused with the journey of Clerval, who observed the scenery with an eye of feeling and delight, than in listening to my reflections. I, a miserable wretch, haunted by a curse that shut up every avenue to enjoyment. We had agreed to descend the Rhine in a boat from Strasbourg to Rotterdam, whence we might take shipping for London. During this voyage we passed many willowy islands and saw several beautiful towns. We stayed a day at Mannheim, and, on the 5th from our departure from Strasbourg, arrived at Mayence. The course of the Rhine below the Mayence becomes much more picturesque. The river descends rapidly and winds between hills, not high but steep, and of beautiful forms. We saw many ruined castles standing on the edges of precipices, surrounded by black woods, high and inaccessible. This part of the Rhine, indeed, presents a singularly variegated landscape. In one spot you view rugged hills, ruined castles overlooking tremendous precipices, with the dark Rhine rushing beneath, and, on the sudden turn of the promontory, flourishing vineyards with green sloping banks, and a meandering river of populous towns occupy the scene. We travelled at the time of the vintage, and heard the song of the laborers as we glided down the stream. Even I, oppressed in mind, and my spirits continually agitated by gloomy feelings, even I was pleased. I lay at the bottom of the boat, and as I gazed on the cloudless blue sky, I seemed to drink in a tranquillity to which I had long been a stranger. And these were my sensations. Who can describe those of Henry? He felt as if he had been transported to fairyland, and enjoyed a happiness seldom tasted by man. "I have seen," he said, "the most beautiful scenes of my own country. I have visited the lakes of Lucerne and Uri. The snowy mountains descend almost perpendicularly to the water, casting black and impenetrable shades, which would cause a gloomy and mournful appearance, were it not for the most verdant islands that relieve the eye by their gay appearance. I have seen this lake agitated by a tempest, and the wind tore up whirlwinds of water and gave you an idea of what the waterspouts must be on the great ocean, and the waves dashed with the fury the base of the mountain, where the priest and his mistress were overwhelmed by an avalanche, and where their dying voices are said still be heard amid the pauses of the nightly wind. I have seen the mountains of La Valais and the Pays de Vaud, but this country, Victor, pleases me more than all those wonders. The mountains of Switzerland are more majestic and strange, but there is a charm in the banks of this divine river that I never before saw equaled. Look at that castle which overhangs young precipice, and also at that island, almost concealed amongst the foliage of those lovely trees, and now that group of laborers coming from among their vines. and that village half hid in the recesses of the mountain. Oh, surely the spirit that inhabits and guards this place has a soul in more harmony with man than those who piled the glacier or retired to the inaccessible peaks of mountains of their own country. What the? Clerval, beloved friend, even now it delights me to record your words and to dwell in the praise of which you are so eminently deserving. He was a being formed in the very poetry of nature. His wild and enthusiastic imagination was chastened by the sensibility of his heart. His soul overflowed with ardent affections, and his friendship was of that devoted and wondrous nature that the worldly minded teach us to look for only in the imagination. But even human sympathies were not sufficient to satisfy his eager mind. The scenery of external nature, which others regard only with admiration, he loved with ardor. The sounding cataract haunted him like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, the deep and glooming wood, their colors and their forms were then to him an appetite, a feeling, and a love that he had no need of a remoter charm, by thought supplied, or of any interest unborrowed from the eye. And where does he now exist? Is this gentle and lovely being lost forever? Has this mind so replete with ideas, imaginations fanciful and magnificent, which formed a world whose existence depended on the life of its creator, has the mind perished? Does it now only exist in memory? No, it is not thus. Your form, so divinely wrought and beaming with beauty, has decayed, but your spirit still visits and consoles your unhappy friend. Pardon this gush of sorrow. These ineffectual words are but a slight tribute to the unexampled worth of Henry, but they soothe my heart, overflowing with the anguish which his remembrance creates. I will proceed with my tale. Beyond Cologne we descended to the plains of Holland, and we resolved to post the remainder of our way. The wind was contrary, but the stream of the river was too gentle to aid us. Our journey here lost the interest arising from beautiful scenery, but we arrived a few days in Rotterdam, whence we proceeded by sea to England. It was on a clear morning in the latter days of December that I first saw the white cliffs of Britain. The banks of the Thames presented a new scene. They were flat but fertile, and almost every town was marked by the remembrance of some story. We saw Tilbury Fort, and remembered the Spanish Armada, Gravesend, Woolwich, and Greenwich, places which I had heard of even in my country. At length we saw the numerous steeples of London, St. Paul's towering above all, and the tower famed in English history. End of chapter 18. Ads are currently knocking on our door, but welcome in, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. We're about to take a brief commercial break, so refill your water, get whatever snacks you need, go to the bathroom. We'll be back in just a few minutes. See you soon. All right, and we return. Or the slightly long break, but Storm Cloud needed dinner. All right. Chapter 19. London was our present present point of rest. We determined to remain several months in this wonderful and celebrated city. Clerval desired the intercourse of the men of genius and talent who flourished at this time, but this was with me a secondary object. I was principally occupied with the means of obtaining the information necessary for the completion of my promise, and quickly availed myself of the letters of introduction that I had brought with me, addressed to the most distinguished natural philosophers. If this journey had taken place during my days of study and happiness, it would have afforded me inexpressible pleasure. But a blight had come over my existence, and I only visited these people for the sake of the information they might give me on the subject in which my interest was so terribly profound. Company was irksome to me. When alone, I could fill my mind with the sights of heaven and earth. The voice of Henry soothed me, and I could thus cheat myself into a transitory peace. But busy, uninteresting, joyous faces brought back despair to my heart. I saw an insurmountable barrier placed between me and my fellow men. This barrier was sealed with the blood of William and Justine, and to reflect on the events connected with those names filled my soul with anguish. But in Clerval I saw the image of my former self. He was inquisitive and anxious to gain experience and instruction. The difference of manners which he observed was to him an inexhaustible source of instruction and amusement. He was also pursuing an object he had long had in view. His design was to visit India, and the belief that he had in his knowledge of its various languages, and the views he had taken of its society, the means of materially assisting the progress of European colonization and trade. In Britain only could he further the execution of his plan. He was forever busy. The only check to his enjoyments was my sorrowful and dejected mind. I tried to conceal this as much as possible, that I might not debar him from the pleasures natural to one who was entering in on a new scene of life, undisturbed by any care or bitter recollection. I often refused to accompany him, alleging another engagement, that I might remain alone. I now also began to collect the materials necessary for my new creation, and this was to make me like the torture of single drops of water continually falling on the head. Every thought that was devoted to it was an extreme anguish, and every word that I spoke in allusion to it caused my lips to quiver and my heart to palpitate. After passing some months in London, we received a letter from a person in Scotland who had formerly been our visitor at Geneva. He mentioned the beauties of his native country and asked us if those were not sufficient allurements to induce us to prolong our journey as far north as Perth, where he resided. Clerval eagerly desired to accept this invitation, and I, though I abhorred society, wished to view again mountains and streams, and all the wondrous works with which nature adorns her chosen dwelling places. We had arrived in England beginning of October, and it was now February. We accordingly determined to commence our journey towards the north at the expiration of another month. In this expedition, we did not intend to follow the great road to Edinburgh, but to visit Windsor, Oxford, Matlock, and the Cumberland Lakes, resolving to arrive at the completion of this tour around the end of July. I packed up my chemical instruments and the materials I had collected, resolving to finish my labors in some obscure nook in the northern highlands of Scotland. We quitted London on the 27th of March, and remained a few days at Windsor, rambling in its beautiful forest. This was a new scene to us mountaineers. The majestic oaks, the quantity of game, and the herds of stately deer were all novelties to us. From thence we proceeded to Oxford. As we entered this city, our minds were filled with the remembrance of events that had been transacted there more century and a half before. It was here that Charles the First had collected his forces. This city had remained faithful to him after the whole nation had forsaken his cause to join the standard of Parliament and liberty. The memory of that unfortunate king and his companions, the amiable Falkland, the insolent Goring, his queen and son, gave a peculiar interest to every part of the city, which they might be supposed to have inhabited. The spirit of elder days found a dwelling here, and we delighted to trace its footsteps. These feelings had not found an imaginary gratification. The appearance of the city had yet in itself sufficient beauty to obtain our admiration. The colleges are ancient and picturesque. Streets are almost magnificent. The lovely Isis which flows beside it through the meadows of exquisite verdure has spread forth into a placid expanse of waters which reflects its majestic assemblage of towers and spires and domes embosomed among aged trees. I enjoyed this scene, and yet my enjoyment was embittered both by the memory of the past and the anticipation of the future. I was formed for peaceful happiness. During my youthful days, discontent never visited my mind, and if I was ever overcome by ennui, the sight of what is beautiful in nature or the study of what is excellent and sublime in the productions of man could always interest my heart and communicate elasticity to my spirits. But I am a blasted tree. A bolt had entered my soul, and I felt then that I should survive to exhibit what I shall soon cease to be, a miserable spectacle of wrecked humanity, pitiable to others and intolerable to myself. We passed a considerable period at Oxford, rambling among its environs and endeavoring to identify every spot which might relate the most animating epoch of English history. Our little voyages of discovery were often prolonged by the successive objects that presented themselves. We visited the tomb of the illustrious Hampden and the field on which that patriot fell. For a moment my soul was elevated from its debasing and miserable fears to contemplate the divine ideas of liberty and self-sacrifice of which these sites were the monuments and remembrancers. For an instant I dared to shake off my chains and look around me with a free and lofty spirit. The iron had eaten into my flesh, and I sank again, trembling and hopeless, into my miserable self. We left Oxford with regret. We proceeded to Matlock, which was our next place of rest. The country in the neighborhood of this village resembled, to a greater degree, the scenery of Switzerland. But everything is on a lower scale, and the green hills want the crown of the distant white Alps, which always attend to the piney mountains of my native country. We visited the wondrous cave and the little cabinets of natural history, where the curiosities are disposed in the same manner as in the collections at Cerveau and Chamonix. Chamonix. The latter name made me tremble when pronounced by Henry. And I hastened to quit Matlock, with which that terrible scene was thus associated. From Derby, still journeying northward, we passed 2 months in Cumberland and Westmoreland. I could now almost fancy myself among the Swiss mountains. The little patches of snow which yet lingered on the northern sides of the mountains, the lakes and the dashing of the rocky streams were all familiar and dear sights to me. Here also we made some acquaintances who almost contrived to cheat me into happiness. The delight of Clerval was proportionately greater than mine. His mind expanded in the company of men and talent, and he found in his own nature greater capacities and resources than he could have imagined himself to have possessed while he associated with his inferiors. I could pass my life here, said he to me, and among these mountains I should scarcely regret Switzerland and the Rhine. But he found that a traveller's life is one that includes much pain amidst its enjoyments. His feelings are forever on the stretch, and when he begins to sink into repose, he finds himself obliged to quit on that which he rests in pleasure for something new. which again engages his attention, which he also forsakes for other novelties. We had scarcely visited the various lakes of Cumberland and Westmoreland, and conceived an affection for some of its inhabitants when the period of our appointment with our Scotch friend approached. We left them to travel on. For my own part, I was not sorry. I had now neglected my promise for some time, and I feared the effects of the daemon's disappointment. He might remain in Switzerland and wreak his vengeance on my relatives. This idea pursued me, and tormented me at every moment from which I might otherwise have snatched repose and peace. I waited for my letters with feverish impatience. If they were delayed, I was miserable and overcome by 1,000 fears, and when they arrived, I saw the superscription of Elizabeth or my father. I hardly dared to read and ascertain my fate. Sometimes I thought that the fiend followed me, and might expedite my remisses by murdering my companion. When these thoughts possessed me, I would not quit Henry for a moment, but followed him as his shadow, to protect him from the fancied rage of his destroyer. I felt as if I had committed some great crime, the consciousness of which haunted me. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head, as mortal as that crime of crime. Did you miss anything? You missed a few things here and there. He's currently traveling with Serval, and they're they're good friends. I visited Edinburgh with languid eyes and mind, and yet that city might have interested the most unfortunate being. Serval did not like it so well as Oxford. The antiquity of the latter city was more pleasing to him, but the beauty and regularity of the new town of Edinburgh, its romantic castle and its environs, the most delightful in the world, Arthur's Seat, St. Bernard's Well, and the Pentland Hills, compensated him for the change, and filled him with cheerfulness and admiration. But I was impatient to arrive at the termination of my journey. We left Edinburgh in a week, passing through Copar, St. Andrews, and along the banks of the Tay to Perth, where our friend expected us. But I was in no mood to laugh and talk with strangers, or to enter into their feelings or plans with the good humor expected from a guest. And I accordingly told Clerval that I wished to make the tour of Scotland alone. "Do you," said I, "enjoy yourself, and let this be our rendezvous. I may be absent a month or two, but do not interfere with my motions, I entreat you. Leave me to peace and solitude for a short time, and when I return, I hope it will be with a lighter heart, more congenial to your own temper." I will stretch and sit now. Thank you, Jim. Henry wished to dissuade me, but, seeing me bent on this plan, ceased to remonstrate. He entreated me to write often. "I had rather be with you," he said, "in your solitary rambles than with these Scotch people, whom I do not know. Hasten, then, my dear friend, to return, that I may again feel myself somewhat at home, which I cannot do in your absence." Having parted from my friend, I determined to visit some remote spot of Scotland, and finish my work in solitude. I did not doubt but that the monster followed me, and would discover himself to me when I should have finished, that he might receive his companion. With this resolution I traversed the northern highlands, and fixed on one of the remotest of Orkneys as the scene of my labors. It was a place fitted for such a work, being hardly more than a rock whose high sides were continually beaten upon by the waves. The soil was barren, scarcely affording pasture for a few miserable cows, and oatmeal for its inhabitants, which consisted of 5 persons, whose gaunt and scraggly limbs gave tokens of their miserable fare. Vegetables and bread, when they indulged in such luxuries, and even fresh water, was to be procured from the mainland, which was about 5 miles distant. From the whole island, there were but 3 miserable huts, and one of these was vacant when I arrived. This I hired. It contained but 2 rooms, and these exhibited all the squalidness of the most miserable penury. The thatch had fallen in, the walls were unplastered, and the door was off its hinges. I ordered it to be repaired, bought some furniture, and took possession, an incident which would doubtless have occasioned some surprise, had not all the senses of the cottagers been benumbed by want and squalid poverty. As it was, I lived ungazed at and unmolested, hardly thanked for but the pittance of food and clothes which I gave, so much does suffering blunt even the coarsest sensations of men. In this retreat, I devoted the morning to labor, but in the evening, when the weather permitted, I walked upon the stony beach of the sea, to listen to the waves as they roared and dashed at my feet. It was a monotonous yet ever-changing scene. I thought of Switzerland. It was far different from this desolate and appalling landscape. Its hills covered with vines, and its cottages are scattered thickly in the plains. Its fair lakes reflect the blue and gentle sky, and, when troubled by the winds, their tumult is but as the play of a lively infant, when compared to the roarings of the giant ocean. In this manner I distributed my occupations when I first arrived, but as I proceeded in my labor, it became every day more horrible and irksome to me. Sometimes I could not prevail on myself to enter my laboratory for several days, and at other times I toiled day and night in order to complete my work. It was, indeed, a filthy process in which I was engaged. During my first experiment, a kind of enthusiastic frenzy had blinded me to the horror of my employment. My mind was intently fixed on the consummation of my labor, and my eyes were shut to the horror of my proceedings. But now I went to it in cold blood, and my heart often sickened at the work of my hands. Thus situated, employed in the most detestable occupation, immersed in a solitude where nothing could for an instant call my attention from the actual scene in which I was engaged, my spirits became unequal. I grew restless and nervous. Every moment I feared to meet my persecutor. Sometimes I sat with my eyes fixed on the ground, fearing to raise them, lest they should encounter the object with which I so much dreaded to behold. I feared to wander from the sight of my fellow creatures, lest when alone he should come to claim his companion. In the meantime I worked on, and my labor was already considerably advanced. I looked towards its completion with a tremulous and eager hope, which I dared not trust myself to question, but which was intermixed with obscure forebodings of evil that made my heart sicken in my bosom. Hmm. End of chapter 19. So here I have a choice. I could continue to read from the book. I could probably complete chapter 20 before the next ad break, and that would be good enough. But there are 5 chapters left. We read chapters 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 today. I think next week we finish the book. Chapters 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. Let me just double check to make sure that is the correct number of chapters. That is. All right. So I'll move us ahead to chapter 20. But I will stop the reading here. Oh, hi, B. Welcome on in. You wish you had me 6 years ago? Were you reading Frankenstein in school at that time, I assume? Oh, wow, yeah. Well, welcome in. It's good to see you. Uh, yeah, I'll admit some parts of this book caught me a little off guard, but I knew that it was an older book and it would have to I'd have to do some edits, but I'm glad that you're enjoying it. But yeah, I've been going for 2.5 hours here, so I'm going to take this time to just chat with everyone for a bit because I've been pretty quiet during the reading. I am going to be putting up the first part of this on, well, I've already put it up on YouTube. I'm going to make sure that it is audible because I think I was a little quiet the first time I was reading. And I'm going to be making sure that these are set up so that when the VOD goes down on Twitch, the video goes up on YouTube for this one in particular. I've been very negligent in putting my streams up on YouTube, or at least making them public on YouTube, but I have been archiving every one as it's come up. So, oh yeah, let me turn on the sound alerts here, because why not? But welcome in, Jam. But yeah, so after this, I don't know when the next book I'm going to do is. I knew that I wanted to do either Frankenstein or Dracula for Halloween, but I'm very open to making this a more frequent thing. I just have to find books that are largely, or not largely, but that are, in the public domain so that I don't get yelled at by publishers because that's a whole thing. I'd love to do some more modern books, but I don't think I could really get away with some of the ones I really want to read. If I'm going to be honest with you, are Terry Pratchett books. I really want to read Terry Pratchett books on stream, but yeah, it's I'm having fun, even if I might have strained my voice a little tonight with all the chapters I read as Adam. So let's see here. Who is available to raid? I see someone who who has raided me, and I have yet to commence my revenge upon. So we are going to say hello to someone who's playing Elden Ring. So it's maybe not as soothing and calming as me yammering on, but we're going to go say hello to Canadia, who is, I mean, it's fitting. We stopped the story in Scotland. We might as well go say hello to somebody who's clearly from Scotland, right? That's how that works, right? But, but yeah. So let's see here. What's a good raid message for tonight? Here we go. We'll do this as our raid message. But yeah, it's good to see everybody. Go say hi to Canadia for me. And I'll be back tomorrow with some more Alien Isolation, and next week we will finish Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So until then, take care, everybody, and thank you all for coming. I'll see you all next time. Have a good one, folks.